Thank all of you for joining us today. Welcome to the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective reading of Anti-Oedipus. I'm going to be semi-host today, moderating, and Brooks. You've got a bunch of the admins and moderators joining us today. We're having a discussion in the discussion chat of himbos and all sorts of non sequiturs around this text. I don't understand what's happening, but that's fine. Before we get into the reading, a couple little bits of housekeeping. First off, I want to say thanks to our first three sponsors. I mean Patreons. We're very close to actually not having this server cost me money every month, which is nice. So thank all three of you. We're trying to figure out how to do rewards and all that. We'll probably drop names next week, but thank you. And if you want to support what we're doing, the easiest way is to volunteer. We always have needs for more busy clickers, more busy chatters, all of those fun things. But if you want to do more, we've got our zine that we're slowly working on getting out there. We have editing of these shows. We have a lot more readings. And let me just say one more time, we have a lot more readings that we're doing, from Heidegger to our literature things to Simon and Foucault, our Zizek group. And we're going to be starting probably Friday this week or next. We're going to be starting the Cinema 1 and 2 reading group, Deleuze's Cinema 1 and 2, which is exciting to me because I love those books. So anything you can do for any of that, we would love to have you join. So beyond that, anyone else have anything else to announce real quick before we get going into this? Kent, Jack, our readings this week, any further news?
Well, Zizek is tomorrow.
Oh, that's right.
Sorry, on Wednesday.
Oh, okay. And we have our anytime. We have our calendar up top, rolling schedule of everything. We're going to be adding in the rest of our talks to that. We're trying to figure out how to schedule them all in. It's a lot of work, to be frank. So we're trying to figure out how best to do that. So we're going to be tossing out a few options. But Zizek is a little bit later this week. Tomorrow is our review. And then we have our literature discussion, I believe, Saturday, Jack?
That's correct. Saturday at noon PDT in Simondan. Sunday at, I believe, 11 a.m. PDT.
Excellent. And the Zizek group, please do join. We're trying to get it all going. Everything's going to be on this server. We're setting them all up. So if you head up to, I believe we called it Join a Reading, little room, feel free to just click on one of those other tabs. You'll see the little emojis, and those emojis will grant you access to the different groups, which is great. So as we get going, we're going to be adding a lot more readings, and as there's more demand, that's where we need more help. So don't hesitate to, don't hesitate to say where you can help. But today we are going to continue reading through chapter 3. We're on section 2, the primitive territorial machine. As always, we're going to be reading through everything, and then we'll do a little bits of analysis as we make our way through. Join us in the discussion chat live. Type away. We will be answering questions and commenting. And if you have something to say, most of you are unmuted. If you are not unmuted, feel free to sort of raise your hand in discussion chat live and say you have something interesting to say. We would love to have that conversation. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and jump in, and we're going to begin the primitive territorial machine. The notion of territoriality merely appears ambiguous, for if it is taken to mean a principle of residence or of geographic distribution, it is obvious that the primitive social machine is not territorial. Only the apparatus of the state will be territorial in this sense because, following Engels' formula, it subdivides not the people, but the territory, and substitutes a geographic organization for the organization of gens. Gens? That's someone's going to have to answer that for me. Yet even where kinship seems to predominate over the earth, it is not difficult to show the importance of local ties. This is because the primitive machine subdivides the people, but does so on an indivisible earth where the connective, disjunctive, and conjunctive relations of each section are inscribed along with other relations. Thus, for example, the coexistence of the coexistence or complementarity of the section chief and the guardian of the earth. Oh, gens is French for people. That's good to know. When the division extends to the earth itself, by virtue of an administration that is landed in residential, this cannot be regarded as a promotion of territoriality. On the contrary, it is rather the effect of the first great movement of deterritorialization on the primitive communes. The imminent unity of the earth, as the immobile motor, gives way to a transcendent unity of an altogether different nature, the unity of the state. The full body is no longer that of the earth. It is the full body of the despot, the unengendered, which now takes charge of the fertility of the soil, as well as the rain from the sky and the general appropriation of productive forces. Hence the savage, primitive Socius, was indeed the only territorial machine in the strict sense of the term. And the functioning of such a machine consists in the following: the declension of alliance and filiation, declining the lineages on the body of the earth before there is a state. So this section opens up really clearly talking about obviously the origin of the sort of body without organs in the original body. Opening up on the savage, the primitive territorial machine, the story of the earth, how savages regarded it, and uses the term savages pretty liberally in here, which I'm not necessarily super comfortable with. It's just the text. Feel free to tell me how else I should reference that. But it's just opening up about the first sort of moments of when we move beyond just the earth into the despot, feudal, the next time period beyond that. That's how I feel for
behind the scenes is The Savage Mind by Levi Strauss.
Mm-hmm. Is that around the same? That's the same time frame?
I believe so.
Yeah, it is. Oh, and it was such an influential book when it landed, too. Yeah. I'm not a fan, personally.
Yeah, unfortunately, that does seem to be something we're still dealing with today, is moving out of the whole idea of like civilization contra savages, right? So as to like kind of say, oh, look how far we've come. Look at who we were. So I do agree with the problematic there. And it's nice too, because I think Deleuze is going to try and speak, or rather Deleuze and Guattari will try to speak to that problem a little bit more. But one comment I wanted to make, aside from the savage and the civil, is I like the point that they're making too, that the Socius and the territoriality machine are not to be understood as the state or as the government, right? Because even though the government does subdivide physical territory, that doesn't seem to be what the Socius does. It's not subdividing physical territory any more than the Socius is a central authority or government.
Well, and I think a lot of their references, so to Kent's point, and it's been forever since I've read Savage Mind and cared about Levi Strauss. It seems like that's very much what they're talking about when they say things like, where's the word? The full body is no longer that of the earth. The concept of the savage mind is that of the untamed mind. Untamed mind might be a better uncontained, unconstrained mind. The savage mind feels like. If someone's more familiar with the text, I'd love a semi sort of refresher on it or a summary if anyone's super familiar.
Well, the idea of the, Levi Strauss was an anthropologist. He studied mythology, and he basically had the idea that the primitive peoples organized things differently than, more advanced peoples. And this is where famously he has the idea of the bricoleur as a person who puts things together that already exist rather than engineers them and creates them from scratch. And so he's basically saying that in that process of bricolage, that there is these underlying structures become apparent. For instance, in the way that villages are laid out, the layout of villages and how those layouts are perceived by the different villagers, and in kinship and in mythology.
What are the chances? Because like chat's saying, they're one of the things they do very often. They did in the last entire chapter, in basically every reference to Lacan or to Freud. There's an edge of sardonic wit where they're almost mocking them inside of that. Is this a little bit of that sort of mocking joke about Levi Strauss at the same time?
I don't know. I haven't sensed that.
All right. Well, maybe we'll get there.
But the thing is that Levi Strauss's structuralism and then the semiotics of de Saussure, that is the whole basis on which Lacan built his theory. So Lacan was very responsive to those new innovations that were coming in at that time in the early 60s. And so Deleuze and Guattari are responding to Lacan's response.
Yeah, and to that point, it may be worth walking out more of this section to understand that that development they're making. So we're talking about the notion of territorialization, right, and the primitive territorial machine. So if territorialization is not geographic based, what is it?
Again for me.
Sorry, I don't understand the question. Could you explain?
Yeah, so when there's basically I'm trying to start a conversation around the subject of territorialization, right? It seems to me Deleuze and Guattari are saying territorialization is not purely geographical. They're developing an understanding of territorialization that's different from that.
Oh, okay, but here in the primitive, it is just geographic.
Right, but they write, for it is taken to mean a principle of residence or of geographic distribution. It is obvious that the primitive social machine is not territorial. So, right, like you said, if they're...
Yeah, okay, so, I don't understand that.
Maybe the better way to ask it then is, what did Deleuze and Guattari mean when they say territorial or territorizing?
I think you might describe it as like an absence of cultural technique, right? That there's a kind of imminent semiotic relationship between world and people that hasn't undergone a kind of organization around a kind of universalization of people via cultural technique.
I really like that. Could you expand on that for a moment? I really liked. I think I'm I'm not sure I fully grasp what you're saying, but I liked where you started. Please do it again.
Here I'm relying on cultural technique from German media theory, right? The idea that like when you start to lay out property lines and you start to grid out territories, there's a kind of, it's a cognitive operation that is reorganizing people into populations to some degree, and one assumes that it would sort of be happening through the despotic signifier. Whereas in the primitive territorial machine, you basically just have a direct relationship to, you are basically earthly social creatures or something like that, in the sense that you're just marked by the earth directly via ritual and tattooing and things like that. And it seems to be more distributed in some way, where there's no territorializing consciousness that might arise from some prototypical gesture to a universal subject.
As they quote, the imminent unity of the earth as the immobile motor gives way to the transcendent unity of an altogether different nature, the unity of the state. The full body is no longer that of the earth; it is the full body of the despot. As they make that move.
Yeah, that's basically where I'm sort of hooking cultural techniques onto that.
Maybe it has to do with the fact that nomadism is the base state. It's not territorial in the sense that nomadism is the fundamental state that the primitive is at.
Yes, because they're on the ultimately the territorialized Earth at that point. The surface at that point is so grand and massive that there is no division. The closest they get, as they describe, is the subdivision of man may be happening, but it's over an undivided Earth.
And it's kind of interesting because this territoriality is a mammalian thing, and but it's unclear whether humans have that territoriality. Maybe private property is like territoriality for humans. I don't know.
Possibly. Would anyone like to read the next paragraph, which I think gets into some of these very specific cases? Jack, how about you? Well, maybe I will then. If declension characterizes the primitive machine, it is because it is not possible simply to deduce alliance from filiation, the alliances from the filiative lines. It would be erroneous to ascribe to alliance no more than an individuating power over the persons of a lineage. It produces instead a generalized distinguishability. E.R. Leach cites cases of very diverse matrimonial regimes where no difference in filiation can be inferred among the corresponding groups. In many analyses, the stress has been upon ties within the unilineal corporation or between different corporations linked by ties of common descent. The structural ties deriving from marriage between members of different corporations have been largely ignored or else assimilated into the all-important descent concept. Thus, Fortes, while recognizing that ties of affinity have comparable importance to ties of descent, disguises the former under his expression complementary filiation. The essence of this concept, which resembles the Roman distinction between egnation and cognation, is that any ego is related to the kinsman of his two parents because he is the descendant of both parents, and not because his parents were married. However, the cross ties linking the different patrilineages laterally are not felt by the people themselves to be of the nature of descent. The continuity of the structure vertically through time is adequately expressed through the agnatic transmission of a patrilineage name. But the continuity of the structure laterally is not so expressed. Instead, it is maintained by a continuing chain of debt relationship of an economic kind. It is the existence of these outstanding debts which assert the continuation of an affinal relationship. Genuinely, this entire paragraph might as well be nonsense to me.
So they're diving in here into the whole problem of the structures of kinship. And this guy, E.R. Leach, was the major person in English who took up structuralism and did a lot of work on structuralism after Levi-Strauss. And his work is very interesting because it kind of clarifies some issues that remain unclear in Levi-Strauss's work. But I have forgotten the term that they have for these groups, but there are these kinship groups where you can't marry in from the other group. I wish I could remember the term, but anyway, within this kinship organization, there is a problem of these kinship groups that don't allow marriage, so that if you have these two groups within a village, say, they won't marry from each other. And so there became a whole problem of how these groupings arose to create these kinship structures. And so that's what they're referring to here.
I'm going to just ask, what does declension mean in this context? Because it is and I spent some time during my read yesterday, spending some time on Google trying to figure out what the hell they actually mean by declension. And I'm going to assume we wish we had some French speakers here with the original text, because it feels like it's so specific, but it's not something we use in English anymore. Like, it's just not a word we use and haven't for a very long time.
Well, it's a grammatical term, but I don't think it means something different in this context, and I have no idea what that is.
So I've spent some time thinking about this. By the way, hello. Sorry, my Wi-Fi dropped out. I did spend some time thinking about this one because I struggled too. And I think actually L.A. the Mason's response really gets into it, because we're talking about territorialization in the sense of like the way that sort of semiotic chains and that seem to fall on bodies and earths, right? Deleuze and Guattari, right? This is because the primitive machine subdivides the people, but does so on an indivisible earth where the connection, disjunctive, and conjunctive relations of each section are inscribed along with the other relations. Thus, for example, the coexistence or complementarity of the section chief and the guardian of the earth, where like the section chief and the guardian of the earth relate to sort of like not just like subjectivities and that, but sort of roles, right? So I think when they're talking about declension and they're going to get into the agonate and the cognate, they're talking about the way that sort of meanings get territorialized and mapped onto people and bodies, right? Or objects and that.
Okay, but in this, and I'm gonna want to spend a little bit of time on this, because this paragraph right here basically is almost a thesis level for the rest of this section, because they refer back to a lot of the terms in here that I simply don't have the ability to really parse. If declension characterizes the primitive machine, it is because it is not possible to simply deduce alliance from filiation, the alliances from the filiative lines. So declension as a concept itself is the way things change over time. Generally, it's used in almost, my understanding, it's almost a negative connotation, a breakdown. A declension is a breakdown, dissemination in a negative way, whatever it may be. And so if we talk about if declension, the concept of things disseminating in a negative way, changing over time, characterizes the primitive machine, it is because it is not possible simply to deduce alliance from filiation, which means the people that I am in this with, my clan, my group, all of that, simply from family lineage. Is that what that means as a sentence?
Yeah, that's about my take on it, because alliance seems to me to be like people coming together more by choice, whereas filiation is more by blood. Blood meaning like, philia being like a brother or a sister or like a family.
So this paragraph is essentially talking about, again, and I'm going to continue asking these questions because I really want to understand this, and I'm sure I'm not alone. This paragraph is talking about the structural nature of pre-modern or pre-despot societies, the savage societies, and how at the time of this savage world, how their alliances were formed, how I chose what groups I was part of, and those things, and how we were able to spot it.
I think so, and in that sense, we're talking about what you just said in terms of territorializing, right? So the way that like coding and that happens in terms of like alliance and blood relations.
Okay, and so they're talking about in this pre-despot society, Fortes, while recognizing that ties of affinity have comparable importance to ties of descent, the people I want to be around versus the people I have to be around, disguises the people I want to be around under complementary affiliation. The essence of this concept, which resembles the Roman distinction between agnation and cognation, is that, and this is a big question I have, any ego is related to the kinsman of his two parents because he is the descendant of both parents and not because his parents were married. Ego here is capitalized, which to me raises a gigantic question of what they mean actually by ego. Do they mean any singular person inside of this? What could they mean by that? It's capitalized, which is confusing as shit to me.
I think that's just an accident of the translation.
Okay.
But the word that I was searching for was moiety. I put it in the chat.
Moiety.
Right. So the thing is that there are these kind of irrational exclusions within kinship systems, where there's moieties that you have to marry out of them. So you can't marry anyone within your moiety, or vice versa. So I think that is kind of like the central problem that they're talking about in this paragraph. It was a theoretical problem in kinship groups, and they're diving right into it.
Okay. So when they're using the term here, ego, they're not necessarily referring to, as the chat was asking earlier, is this the Freudian version of ego inside of it? But instead, how I hate using the word savage. I hate using the word savage, but I'm just going to use it because that's what they're talking about here. That any ego is related to the kinsman of his two parents. They're not talking about ego in the Freudian sense. They're talking about sort of a singular, standalone person.
Yeah, I think so.
And that's why they capitalize it, because they're using it. I mean, it's an awkward translation. Such an awkward translation.
I read it a little differently in the sense that it's capitalized because they're referring to a notion of ego at large, which is to say, like, if it is Freudian, we're not necessarily concerned with the id here. We're concerned with that principle of the or that part of the unconscious that regulates reality and pleasure, being derived or inherited from, I believe it was, being derived or inherited from your parents.
So the end of this chapter that focuses on the cross ties linking different patrilineages are not felt by people themselves to be the nature of descent. The continuity of the structure vertically through time is adequately expressed to the agnatic transmission of a patrilineage name. It sounds like a high schooler who got a hold of a thesaurus. This is, to simplify, the ability for me to see where I come from in the groups that I belong to. There is a level where it's who I choose to be around, and then there's who I'm directly connected to. Talking about ultimately how social production exists inside of the sort of the savage time frame, the pre-setup.
Well, okay, so the thing I think that is the basic thing to be aware of is that kinship groups are complicated in primitive society. So there's a lot of extra terms within the structure of kinship groups, and this was a big part of structuralism to try to disentangle those various kinship structures and try to see how they're formed and try to understand kinship as a as a science. So there's a lot of technical terms associated with it.
Right, that's fair. It's the need to basically have a degree in anthropology in order to read a single paragraph of this book just frustrates my mind, basically. Because a lot of this is just outside of my grasp to be able to really understand how it applies directly. Ultimately, what we're talking about here is the way pre-modern societies or pre-feudal societies dealt with filiation and descendants, and how they attached and how they were part of different groups versus the despotic times where we very much attached ourselves to, I'm French, I'm with these people, this is my king, this is who I'm, and that's the people I'm with. I mean, that's the short version, not to fast forward at all.
Well, you have tribes, you have clans, you have these moieties within the clans.
Yes.
So in primitive society, that's a very complex structure. Just like, for instance, one of the things they found out in linguistics was that primitive languages are more complex than modern languages as well.
Well, and Lou copied and pasted in the chat from Holland, which this is actually really worth reading because we're going over this. The central function of Chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus is to historicize social production's repression of desiring production, to show that Oedipus is the specifically capitalist mode of such repression by contrasting it with other modes. The account which Deleuze and Guattari provide of three modes of social production, savagery, despotism, capitalism, is best understood not as a history of modes of social production, oh, that's my mistake then, but as genealogy of the Oedipus. Genealogy, in the sense of the term Foucault derives from Nietzsche, is based on the premise that historical institutions and other features of historical organization evolve not smoothly and continuously, gradually developing their potential through time, but discontinuously, and must be understood in terms of difference rather than continuity. As one social formation appropriates and abruptly reconfigures an older institution or revives various features of extant social organization by selectively recombining them to suit its own purpose. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, the events that restore a thing to life in a given form of social organization are not the same as those that gave rise to it in the first place. The Oedipus did not arise at the dawn of civilization and evolve smoothly. The third chapter of Anti-Oedipus shows, on the contrary, that the modern Oedipus was cobbled together out of elements from previous social formations, which we're starting with now. I like that a lot. That helps me understand that paragraph. Would anyone like to read the next one? Hopefully understand it better than I'm doing.
Now that my Wi-Fi is working, I can take you up on volunteering.
Excellent. Sounds great, Jack.
Cool. Violation is administrative and hierarchical, but alliance is political and economic, and expresses power insofar as it is not fused with the hierarchy and cannot be deduced from it, and the economy insofar as it is not identical with administration. Filiation and alliance are like the two forms of primitive capital, fixed capital or filiative stock, and circulating capital or mobile blocks of debt. There are two memories that correspond to them, the one biofiliative, the other a memory of alliance and of words. While production is recorded in the network of filiative disjunctions on the Socius, the connections of labor still must detach themselves from the productive process and pass into the element of recording that appropriates them for itself as quasi-cause. But it can accomplish this only by reclaiming the connective regime for its own, in the form of an affinal tie or pairing of persons that is compatible with the disjunctions of filiation. It is in this sense that the economy goes by way of alliance. In the production of children, the child is inscribed in relation to the disjunctive lines of its father or mother. But inversely, the disjunctive lines inscribe it only through a connection represented by the marriage of the father and the mother. At no time, therefore, does alliance derive from filiation, but both form an essentially open cycle where the Socius acts on production, but also where production reacts on the Socius.
I think one thing, that we should keep in mind is that there's matrilineal as well as patrilineal forms of filiation.
They do seem to actually not give necessarily patrilineal or matrilineal preference. I mean, they talk about filiation, marriage of the mother or the father. They talk about both pretty openly, actually.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to say that the ground state isn't necessarily patriarch.
Okay, and that would fit into talking about too how like the society we're discussing right now and the social machine and territorializing relative to this society is not quite like the Oedipalized society we've been discussing, or we're at least used to in contemporary times.
Well, and again, to what Holland was talking about, that these things don't blend nicely, continuously out of each other, that, it's always been the case that, the father represents the law and is the one in charge, and the mother's the caregiver, that it's actually, and it's what Holland said, that these things happen disjointedly and are sort of cobbled together with a lot of different things and happen suddenly, rewriting their past. And that's a big focus of this one. The ability for production to be recorded inside of this and how it's recorded on the disjunction of the Socius, I think applies directly to that.
Yeah, and I looked up what agonate versus cognate means. I'm getting this from a site called WikiDiff, so there is probably some risk on this one, but it looks like as nouns, the difference between, and I'm quoting now, as nouns, the difference between agonate and cognate is that agonate is a relative whose relation is traced only through male members of the family, while cognate is one of a number of things allied in origin or nature. Yet, as adjectives, the difference between agonate and cognate is that agonate is related to someone by male connections or on the paternal side of the family, while cognate is allied by blood, kindred by birth, specifically legal, related on the mother's side.
See, I think the key in this paragraph is this sentence that says filiation and alliance are like two forms of primitive capital. Fixed capital or filiative stock, and circulating capital or mobile blocks of debt. So another thing to be aware of is that in these kind of primitive societies, there's they were gift societies for the most part, and so the archetypal form of that is in the Trobriand Islands, and I think it was Malinowski that studied that, and so from island to island they would have these gifts that would circulate, and so then the economic activity kind of followed the circulation of the gifts, and they had certain gifts that circulated in a clockwise direction, and other gifts that circulated in a counterclockwise direction. And so the gift giving was the thing that set up the basis for trade. So the important thing was the gift giving, but in the wake of that, then they did trade between the islands, and the trade went clockwise and counterclockwise in a very kind of systematic way. But all that gift giving structure is based on kinship structures, and so it's a very complex system of exchange that was occurring, in these these primitive societies, where you really only had barter as the basis for economic activity.
Yeah, and I think they're going to expand on that more when they get further into things like gift giving. But because you mentioned that sentence about filiation and alliance compared to fixed capital and circulating capital, I think too it's important to look at, right, they're talking about fixed capital as almost something as corresponding to a memory of the biofiliative, right? So like that's really interesting because they're talking about fixed capital, or like at some level, I think of fixed capital in an economic sense as machines, institutions, and larger apparatuses. as being related to biology, or at least life, being the prefix bio, in contrast to a memory of alliance and of words, which is compared to circulating capital. Here we go. Circulating capital or mobile blocks of debt, which is a memory of like signification, right, or words, and of alliance. So it seems too that there's a difference between how we relate to one another in terms of like what we're connecting with, as it's going to be either through a sort of shared living or shared relationships through blood, versus through something more like debt, where it's the memory of what was spoken that really we fall back on.
Right. In a gift society, there's guest-host relationships. And so, this alliance part could be a reference to those guest-host relationships that were very important.
I'd love to spend a moment on the last sentence of that paragraph. At no time does alliance derive from filiation, but both form an essentially open cycle where the Socius acts on production, but also where production reacts on the Socius. Feels like a very unique thing as they talk about the genealogy of the Socius and all these things and how they've happened. That last part, unless I've been wrong, the Socius doesn't necessarily act on production, but production reacts on the Socius seems unique to this, the way that they've been talking about these things.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things I think we should focus on here is their use of the term quasi-cause. I'm not sure that they mentioned that before, but quasi-cause is a big deal in Deleuze's own earlier work. And basically, quasi-causes are like side effects.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's like correlations rather than causation.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yes, and he talks about that in all of his earlier works. It's actually not very much in this book, is it?
Yeah, but you see, the thing is that so I'm interpreting this paragraph, not quite understanding it completely like you, but I'm interpreting it like if you think of the Trobriand Island case, where you have the gift giving in one direction and then the counter gift giving in the other direction, and you have these two flows that are both circles but in different directions, and then the economic activity is following in the kind of trail of that. You could see that there's like a quasi-cause relationship between the two cycles, perhaps.
Yes. So to talk about what quasi-cause means, because it's such an interesting one, it follows, in my understanding, Deleuze's definition of the virtual. The virtual is layer above the material. The material world interacts. The way that those material things interact makes things that are virtual. They don't actually exist. They're just existing only in the interactions of those. And quasi-cause is almost one more layer removed, where the interactions of the virtual, these things that are effects of the material, when they interact, those are quasi-cause those are quasi-cause effects. So it's another layer sort of virtualized of the virtual. And it's interesting that they use it here because it's because they're talking about so many of these things at a deeply material level. So to be like multiple layers removed now is interesting.
Yeah, and if you walk that back to because we're trying to understand that concluding sentence. If we look at the top of the sentence, filiation is administrative and hierarchical, but alliance is political and economic, and expresses power insofar as it is not fused with the hierarchy and cannot be deduced from it, and the economy insofar as it is not identical with administration. So we are actually talking about the formal economic and the economic organization and power structures in the society, right? And the sort of territorializing that these structures kind of undertake, right? So affiliation is administrative and hierarchical. This sounds to me kind of like the idea that, right, the prince follows the king and all that, or like, you do you kind of like carry on what your father did. So like if your pops is a blacksmith, this isn't a great example. I should probably not use like the Middle Ages, but maybe something more like, if your pops is a good hunter, you're supposed to kind of take on managing hunting, or, these kind of older notions of administrative and hierarchical understanding of yourself and the society, as opposed to alliance where you're developing political and economic relationships and you're sort of engaging in a different way of, in a different territorialization, right? Whereby you're dealing with how to engage politically with things and how to sort of economically engage with them, which seems to speak to the level of that last sentence we were talking about of this section, where we're talking about alliance not deriving from filiation, but both forming an essentially open cycle where the Socius acts on production, but also where production reacts on the Socius, where they have production has a reflexive relationship with the Socius.
Yeah, so they're implying that the Socius is filial and the production is an alliance. But the big picture here is that Marxism has a hard time dealing with this whole gift-giving structure in prehistory that was not primarily economic.
Yeah, be careful. The next sentence seems to respond to that, because otherwise I would probably agree with you. But because the next sentence is, Marxists are right to remind us that if kinship is dominant in primitive society, it is determined as dominant by economic and political factors, meaning alliance.
Right, but it's not the whole story. That's okay.
I am on mute. That is good to know. The last sentence, I'd like to sort of put out how I'm reading it now. And if we take that first part, at no time, therefore, does alliance drive from filiation, but actually that alliance, they form an open cycle where one acts on the other and then the other acts on the other, so that alliance does drive filiation, but also filiation drives alliance. It's part of a cooperative cycle that goes back and forth, one driving the other, but at no point is one necessarily the one that is ultimately driving it completely. Which seems to be the push for the last 2 or 3 paragraphs that I have not been able to fully understand. But he seems to be talking in response to a few people that he cites here that are very much pushing the idea that filiation is what drove pre-modern times, the savage times, that these alliances were driven primarily by who had what kids and how those things worked out. And he's saying, no, it was a cycle of alliance that didn't necessarily derive from filiation or filiation from alliance, but that they actually reacted upon each other.
Yeah, I think we're definitely getting somewhere, because we're trying to understand how the Socius in this society territorializes, right? And so they write, while production is recorded in the network of filiative disjunctions on the Socius, the connections of labor still must attach themselves from the productive process and pass into the element of recording that appropriates them for itself as quasi-cause. So I think you're right to point out the open cycle aspect of this. The production of children, I think, is like probably the best example they're giving right now, where the child is inscribed during production in relation to the disjunctive lines of its father or mother. But inversely, the disjunctive lines inscribe it only through a connection represented by the marriage of the father and the mother. So, there's an alliance of the father and mother, but there's also the sort of like either or, it must be the father or mother's production of the child, right? Which sounds like it's more like affiliative in the sense that like you're trying to understand who should administrate the child productively.
All right. Well, would anyone like to read the next paragraph? I think it's a good idea to move on a little bit here because I think we've already started reading the next paragraph. Anyone? All right, I'll give it a shot. Marxists are right to remind us that if kinship is dominant in primitive society, it is determined as dominant by economic and political factors. And if filiation expresses what is dominant while being itself determined, alliance expresses what is determinate, or rather the return of the determinant in the determinant system of dominance. Christ. That is why it is essential to take into consideration how ties of alliance combine concretely with relations of filiation on a given territorial surface. Leach has specifically underscored the importance of local lineages insofar as they are differentiated from lineages of filiation and insofar as they operate at the level of small segments. It is these groups of men residing in the same area or in neighboring areas who arrange marriages and shape concrete reality to a much greater extent than do the systems of filiation and the abstract matrimonial classes. A kinship system is not a structure but a practice, a praxis, a method, and even a strategy. Louis Berth, analyzing a relationship of alliance and hierarchy, shows convincingly that a villain intervenes as a third party to prevent matrimonial connections between elements that the disjunction of two moieties would forbid from the strict viewpoint of structure. The third term must be interpreted much more as a method than as a true structural element. Every time one interprets kinship relations in the primitive commune in terms of structure unfolding in the mind, one relapses into an ideology of large segments that make alliance depend on the major filiations, and that finds itself contradicted by practice. It is necessary to ask if there exists in the asymmetrical systems of alliance a fundamental tendency towards generalized exchange, that is to say, towards the closing of the cycle. I have been unable to find anything of that nature among the Muru. Everyone behaves as if he were ignorant of the compensation that would result from the closing of the cycle, and everyone stresses the behavior of asymmetry, emphasizing the creditor-debtor behavior. A kinship system only appears closed to the extent that it is severed from the political and economic references that keep it open, and that make alliance something other than an arrangement of matrimonial classes and filiative lineages. I'm sure this is going to be a fun one.
I think this is starting to click with me more because, like, right, so you can understand your father in filiative terms, right? So, like, your father is above you, and you are the child, and there's sort of a hierarchy that comes with that, right? So that would be your more filiative understanding. But when you start talking about an alliance with your father, you're talking about achieving political and economic strategies, right? Which might be accumulating resources together. And even then, like, alliance not necessarily being friendship, but alliance being a mutual grouping for some sort of, in this case, strategic reason, as opposed to like a hierarchical structure that is simply a way of understanding the society through paternal and maternal relations, so as to understand how things like capital or how things like object and production should be sort of flowing in that sense.
I think I'm reading this in a different direction. I think for me, the sentence that jumps out here that helps me piece together the last few paragraphs, and please everyone keep typing because it's really important in this section. We get a lot of opinions because I don't think I'm right either. They're talking at length that a kinship system is not a structure but a practice. The last few paragraphs, they've talked about the way that these systems are set up: kinship, lineage, through affiliation, through affiliation, basically how these societies are built. But they've been talking about it very much through the lens of structure, and the structure that we have now. And what they're saying here through the second half of this paragraph is more how I understand it as well, that at the time, there was no concept of structure to it, that it was a process. And I'm not sure practice, praxis, method, strategy is all really good translations, but it feels like they're talking about the process of how these societies grew and shifted and changed. Isn't necessarily a structure as we know it, but instead it's a process that's ongoing, that people don't give two thoughts to the closing of the cycle or how the cycle grows and changes, but instead that the process of the whole thing is their reality. And Dionysian Waves, actually, the thing that connects in my brain is in 1,000 Plateaus, when they're talking about the rhizomatic structure of society. This feels very spot on to that.
So what this reminds me of is Bourdieu in his logic of practice. So he comes up with the idea of habitus. Basically, he starts wondering, well, where are these structures in society? I mean, what makes it so that people spontaneously produce these structures in primitive societies? And so Bourdieu comes up with this idea of the habitus as being the basis for the practice that produces the structure as a side effect. And another book that's really interesting is De Certu, The Practice of Everyday Life, where he takes what Bourdieu came up with and tries to extend it and try to understand this the theory of practice a bit better.
And I think in the second half of this paragraph, it feels like what they're trying to say is that these things aren't structural in the same sense. When we talk about the body without organs in the modern capitalist sense, as they have in the last few, especially when they're talking about Oedipus, they're talking deeply about structure, and that we fit into these machines and apparatuses, and the structure of these machines and apparatuses and how they're built. Whereas it feels like they're saying that there's maybe not a kinship machine is not a possible thing, because it's a process that's continually working and not a structure. And the way that it's looked at was very, very different at the time. There feels like an edge of the noble savage myth playing out throughout this as well. I'm having a difficult time with a lot of this, and I don't have a lot of background in anthropology, but it does feel like a little bit of the noble savage thing happening here. But that's, to me, what they're talking about or trying to say is that the structure of things looked at cynically, that this is the way things have to be because this is the structure of our time, instead is a practice that they were continually in, not to sound too hippie, but it's like in the moments, in the time, here's where we're at, here's what I'm doing, this is what I'm working on, rather than here's the way our society functions. No one really thought about it in that sense.
So one thing I noticed, and I think this speaks to your point, is when they write every time one interprets kinship relations in the primitive commune in terms of a structure unfolding in the mind, one relapses into an ideology of large segments that makes alliance depend on the major affiliations, and it finds itself contradicted by practice. So at one level, like, if we're talking about structure as something that exists in the mind and apart from practice, then I think you're absolutely right. This is a misunderstanding of structure in this society. Going on from that, they seem to be trying to point out that these societies actually have a way of have a third party, which is the village, or like a larger sort of social collectivity that seems to actually respond to these filiative and alliant relationships, where they write, if I can find it, Louis Berth, analyzing a relationship of alliance and hierarchy, shows convincingly that a village intervenes as a third party to permit matrimonial connections between elements that the disjunction of the two matois would forbid from the strict viewpoint of structure.
Does anyone have a read on what Muskie's bringing up, which is so everyone behaves as if he were ignorant of the compensation that would result of the closing of the cycle. I am absolutely behaving that way because I am ignorant of the compensation that would result from the closing. What would be the benefit of the closing of the cycle?
Well, so the structures, if you think of the Trobriand Islanders trade on a gift basis, the structures kind of determine how that flow will go, around between the islands, right? But what he's saying is that people are making pragmatic decisions all the time that contravene the structures, and so that's where praxis comes in, and in fact that's true because what happens in the Trobriand Island case is that people jockey to be the person who is going to get the gift, right? Because there's a lot of pride and a lot of historically the names are associated with the gifts, and so people want to get the gift. But the person who's giving the gift, they want to give the gift that's going to increase their prestige and their trade, and the person who wants to get the gift, they want to increase their and they're competing with other people who could get the gift, and so there's all of these pragmatic decisions that are happening in every gift giving situation that's going to be taken into account, and that's the pragmatic thing that violates the structure.
I see where you're coming from, but I think it's the critique of the structure as though it's something only mental. Which is contradicted by the praxis. It seems to me what they're saying is that the structure is in the praxis, and therefore the structure is not, it's not ideological, it's not purely mental. If you're looking for it, you've got to look at the way they're behaving and what they're actually doing.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying that when structuralism first came along, they treated it as if these were a priori structures that are in the unconscious, and they just manifest, involuntarily. And later with like Bourdieu and in this book, they're saying no, there's a practical aspect of the, decisions are made with every interchange.
I think you both are kind of right. So like my whole read on it that I was trying to figure out, and maybe it'll be valuable to say with my voice, is that they're talking about these structures because they're not like complete structures, right? They're made out of asymmetries and breaks, right? And so that, because I think that's what both of you have brought up, right? That these structures are either a priori parts of the unconscious, or you're a structuralist anthropologist and you're looking at this economic structure, right? As if it's this, static thing that's just a part of the society that you can take apart and sort of look at. But what they want to talk about is the way that these alliances and kinships are, sort of like flows, right? They're, or maybe they're not sort of flows, they are flows that it's a movement. It's not a complete object. It's a network of these sort of hubs where things will flow from one corner of an alliance to another, one moiety to another, and then I think that's what they're getting at. But then that's what raises the question for me. Well, then are they just being ironic when they say, well, no one seems to be aware of what the benefit could bring when you close the cycle, right? Because closing the cycle would seem to make everything static.
So that's why, Lou, did you want to say something?
I don't think Lou's mic is working.
Oh, darn. Well, then I'll briefly reply. Muskie, I think I agree with you. What I'm getting at, though, is that it's not that the structure is necessarily a priori. It seems to be that they're talking about the structure as though it's a purely mental thing or something that exists unconsciously or consciously, like you're saying, which is like what they're responding to and criticizing, I think. So as to say that the structures, I think how I'm reading this is that the structures are in the praxis, right? And so if you want to say structure is in the mental, then that structure is immediately contradicted by what they're doing. And so when they write, everyone behaves as if he were ignorant of the compensation that result from the closing of the cycle. And everyone stresses the relationship of asymmetry, emphasizing the creditor-debtor behavior. That does still seem to, that emphasis does still seem to speak to a kind of structure who in practice is not like the one we're used to, which I'm comparing to something more like an ideology. But anyways, right, they conclude with the kinship system only appears close to the extent that it is severed from the political and economic references that keep it open, and they make alliance something other than an arrangement of matrimonial classes and filiative lineages. It seems to be that, the basic critique there is that you can't understand one without the other, or that is to say, kinship systems only look like they're closing if you ignore the alliance systems or the alliances that are actually keeping them open.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that was well said.
Yes, actually. Thank you for that, Jack.
I could be wrong, but that's where my interpretation is at. And like I said, like there's your father as like your hierarchical patronage, whereby like your inheritance matters. But there's also your father as an as an alliance, right? Where you guys are working to a political or economic end. And at that level, you can see the closed off inheritance versus what you and your father are trying to engage in at almost like a horizontal level.
Well, who would like to read the next paragraph, which gets into this actually a little bit more and starts using the wonderful term nomads a lot more? Anyone? Because I will dive in. No, Alyosha, you're muted. Just unmute yourself.
If Alyosha can't unmute themselves, I'll volunteer.
He's got it. Maybe his mic's not working. That's fine. I'll go ahead and read the next section. Or Jack, you wanted to? Go for it.
Real quick, Alyosha, do you want to try your mic? After you unmute it? Okay, we tried.
Sorry, pronouns. My bad. Yes, they seem to be having issues with their mics. I've had too much caffeine today.
There you go. We'll give them the paragraph to sort it out then. It is the same for the whole project of coding the flows. How does one ensure reciprocal adaptation, the respective embrace of a signifying chain, and flows of production? The great nomad hunter follows the flows, exhausts them in place, and moves on with them to another place. He reproduces in accelerated fashion his entire filiation and contracts it into a point that keeps him in a direct relationship with the ancestor or the god. Pierre Clastres describes the solitary hunter who becomes identical with his force and his destiny, and delivers his song in a language that becomes increasingly rapid and distorted. Me, I am a powerful nature, a nature incensed and aggressive. Such are the two characteristics of the hunter. The great paranoiac of the bush or the forest, a real displacement with the flows and direct filiation with the god. It has to do with the nature of nomadic space, where the full body of the Socius is as if adjacent to production. It has not yet brought production under its sway. The space of the encampment remains adjacent to that of the forest, and is constantly reproduced in the process of production, but has not yet appropriated this process. The apparent objective movement of inscription has not suppressed the real movement of nomadism, but a pure nomad does not exist. there is always and already an encampment where it is a matter of stocking, however little, and where it is a matter of inscribing and allocating, of marrying and of feeding oneself. Clastres shows well how among the Gyaki, the connection between the hunters and the living animals is succeeded in the encampment by a disjunction between the dead animals and the hunters, a disjunction similar to an incest prohibition, since the hunter cannot consume his own kill. In short, as we shall see elsewhere, there is always a pervert who succeeds the paranoiac or accompanies him, sometimes the same man in two situations, the bush paranoiac and the village pervert.
Yeah, sorry, Aloysius. I don't think we can hear you still.
It's fine. We'll continue moving on through the paragraph. Any quick thoughts over this one? Because I was busy trying to fix Alyosha's microphone and chatting with a few people.
Yeah, so what they were saying about the noble savage thing, I think it rings like this is a paragraph where you're going to look at it and you're going to see like, oh, they're sort of, holding up these examples of societies as these sort of idealized, fictional, racist, narratives that don't really exist, but they're, appropriating them for their purposes. And I think there's a lot to be said about that criticism. I guess at the same time, what's useful is the sort of, I guess, what Lou was saying about this being less of like these sort of prescriptive, like society should look like this or human nature looks like this. It's better if you read it like the genealogy of Oedipus. So they're sort of describing a series of stages by which we go from, this fictionalized, racist sort of caricature that they're working with to Oedipus. And so that's how we want to like rehabilitate this, I guess, in criticism, or at least respond to that criticism, because it might be a very, very serious one for this work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm seeing the noble savage here. I see them criticizing a way of, I see them both engaging and criticizing a way of understanding these sort of pre-capitalist societies. And in the sense that, like, they're dealing with, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, like here they're dealing with Clastres and the example of you're either the hunted or the killed being similar to the idea of you're either the person paranoid of being perverted or you're the pervert. This way that they're sort of gesturing toward the coming social machine of capitalism, the coming sort of deterritorializing and reterritorializing of this of a society. But they're starting out by talking about the way that these societies, these villages, it seems, do have these structures that exist in a different manner than ours, living in a capitalist society.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I like that read a lot, but I think where the criticism is going to come in is if you read this paragraph as being like prescriptive, right? Where they're saying like, it's better to be this kind of nomad thing that is maybe, not exactly super realistic, right? And they're sort of appropriating a bunch of different narratives to sort of construct this thing.
Well, and we have to also be careful because, I mean, we did our reading of Clastres early on in the collective, and it's hard not to read his work, in my mind, as someone who very much considers the noble savage thing to be almost intrinsic to his writing. It's very much throughout everything he writes that they're almost better than us as people, savages. that we've lost something, they've gained something. I'm sensitive to the noble savage thing. I worked on Avatar, so like if you want to get like what of the worst kind of noble savage, it's that kind of stuff. So it's it very much has that same feel. And so when we're reading this chapter and they're talking about the Clastris reference they make among the Geaki, the connection between hunters and living animals is succeeded in the encampment by discharge. It's even here they're very much talking about it, how it's a positive, better than us thing. I don't see it as anything else. It's very, very strong in this.
I think the difficulty in this chapter will be, and currently is, that what they are doing is they read structuralism and they read it against structuralism, kind of like they did in the last chapter with psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis and structuralism are inseparable. So I think the productive question we need to ask is, how did the structuralists that they cite and that they read interpret what they cite here, what they quote here, and what do they do differently than the structuralists? I think a lot of this noble savagery and the more and specifically the language they use here, they inherit from structuralism in this section. And I think if we look to 1,000 Plateaus, it's very clear that this is not their language, because in 1,000 Plateaus, all these things about stages and they talk there differently about history. They are less structuralist there. And I think we need to look for what are the differences between what they do here and what the structuralists they quote did before them to make this productive.
I think that's really fair, actually, Lou. Thank you. That's really fair. But I mean, a lot of what they're doing here, I almost read as less their direct commentary on savage societies, and more of them discussing it as they would in anything else, the difference between us and them. Because the very next paragraph opens with, once the Socius becomes fixed, they're trying to describe and talk through a time where there is no fixed Socius. There is no set structure to the way things are. So to your point about their discussion around structuralism or not, and how they're making, I think it is more commentary than direct. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Particularly with the thing about structure, there's also I haven't read too much Deleuze and Guattari outside of what we are doing here, but I know what Bruno Latour does with structure, and if that is actually based on what Deleuze and Guattari do here, structure just disappears, right? So this is not the kind of structure that Bourdieu even would talk about. In a sense, I would even argue that Bourdieu kind of wants to save structuralism for this kind of treatment that Deleuze and Guattari then brought in.
I'd like to bring up the fact that, with recent archaeological finds, there's, I put up in the chat, there's Chateau Hayuk and there's Gobekli Tepe are two archaeological finds. The first one is nomadic, but it's a place where the nomads got together. And the second one is agricultural, early agricultural cell. And so by studying these sites, we've got a much better picture now of some of the things that were going on back then. Whereas in early structuralism, there was like no evidence, no data. They were just they were just going on off of what anthropologists were, how they were analyzing primitive cultures that existed at that time.
Fair. Well, I'm gonna push for us to keep going because we've got a little bit to go before we finish up the section. I want to make sure we get through it. Let's put a pin in this for tomorrow and make sure that we cover this in the review because I think it's a very interesting discussion and it's going to impact. It impacts kind of everything they write about from here out, so it's worth talking through. I'm going to go ahead and read out the next paragraph. Once the Socius becomes fixed, falling back on the productive forces and appropriating them for its own, the problem of coding can no longer be resolved by the simultaneity of a displacement from the standpoint of the flows and an accelerated reproduction from the standpoint of the chain. The flows must be the object of deductions that constitute a minimum of stock, and the signifying chain must be the object of detachments that constitute a minimum of mediations. A flow is coded insofar as detachments from the chain and deductions from the flows are affected in correspondence, united in a mutual embrace. And this is already the highly perverse activity of local groups who arrange marriages on the surface of the primitive territoriality. A normal or non-pathological perversity, as Henry A. would say, referring to other cases where a psychic work of selection, refinement, and calculation was manifested. And this is the case from the start, since there does not exist a pure nomad who can be afforded the satisfaction of drifting within the flows and singing direct filiation, but always a Socius waiting to bear down, already deducting and attaching. Short version, feel free if anyone wants to jump in otherwise. But the short version for me for this paragraph is, in my little notes, are that this is where they're talking about actually how the body without organs operated pre-despot in the savage times, whatever. I hate that word so fucking much. During this pre-despot time period, the body without organs effectively works only almost at the hyper-local level inside of these very specific moments when all of these components are coming together. That is the structure, that is the fix, the place that it falls back on productive forces. And that at the grand level, there really isn't one because of everything being so changing and shifting all the time.
I think too. Do you mean to say there is no body without organs because everything is shifting it all the time?
No, I mean that the way the Socius works, the place where it's fixed is at the almost hyper local. When they talk about specifically, this is already highly perverse activity of the local groups who arrange marriages on the surface of the primitive territoriality. That the act of arranging marriages is effectively where this Socius, body without organs, whatever it may be, the Socius actually operates and falls back on things, the way the genealogy of it all. Pardon me.
Yeah, I think I do like the emphasis on the genealogy of it because it seems to be a lot of what's going on here. I'll just say too, I like the sentence, a flow is coded insofar as detachments from the chain and deductions from the flow are affected in correspondence, united in a mutual embrace. I think that's a really interesting description of codifying flows.
All right. I will go ahead and read the next paragraph, and then we have just 2 pages to get through, just a couple pages, but it's a lot. So let's see what we can do. The flow deductions constitute affiliative stock in the signifying chain, but inversely, the detachments from the chain constitute mobile debts of alliance that guide and direct the flows. On the blanket that serves as a familial stock, ephemeral stones or cowries are made to circulate. There is a sort of vast cycle of flows of production and chains of inscription, and a lesser cycle between the stock's affiliation and connect and encast the flows, and the blocks of alliance that cause the chains to flow. Descent is at the same time flow of production and chain of inscription, stock affiliation and fluxion of alliance. Everything takes place as though the stock constituted a surface energy of inscriptions or recording, the potential energy of the apparent movement. But debt is the actual direction of this movement, a kinetic energy that is determined by the respective paths of the gifts and counter-gifts on the surface. Among the kula, the circulation of necklaces and bracelets comes to a standstill in certain places, on certain occasions, so that stock may be reformed. There are no productive connections without disjunctions of filiation that appropriate them. But there are no disjunctions of filiation that do not reconstitute lateral connections across the alliances and pairings of persons. Not only the flows and the chains, but the fixed stocks and the mobile debts, insofar as they in turn imply relations between chains and flows in both directions, are in a state of perpetual relativity. Their elements vary: women, consumer goods, ritual objects, rights, prestige, and status. They're talking about the early versions of flows of the marketplace.
Yeah, and certainly of debt and private property, right? Because if I remember correctly, in the last section, they were talking about, the social machine of capitalism dealing with the abstractions of privatization and of, what was it? Of private property and... Does anybody ever remember the second one?
Nope.
Well, you're remembering that the when they talk about debts, what they mean is debts in a gift-giving society, not the kind of way we think about debts. If you're given something, then the question is, when are you going to reciprocate? Do you reciprocate immediately? Do you reciprocate after a certain time? If you don't reciprocate at all, what are the implications of that for the sustained relationship? I think that's what they mean by debt.
Yeah, I agree with you, and that's the alliance of it, right? But also the we could get into the affiliative side with it as well. Just want to mention it's privatization and abstraction. That was the other one.
So quite clearly here, they're taking the Trobriand Island case, as a kind of exemplary, because it has these two flows in opposite directions.
Yeah, I thought the sentence that stuck out to me was, there are no productive connections without disjunctions of filiation that appropriate them. But there are no disjunctions of filiation that do not reconstitute lateral connections across the alliances and pairings of persons. This seems to be what we were saying too about, even in a gift-giving economy dealing with debt and credit that way, there's still a way that, yes, there's stuff that moves upwards and downwards administratively and hierarchical in the filiative sense, but there's no either or the filiative. Therefore, the hierarchical or the administrative, that does not reconstitute the lateral or the sort of horizontal connections across the alliances and pairings of persons.
Yeah. So the thing that so if you've got these two cycles of gifts of different kinds that go, one's the dominant gift, which are really important gifts that are going in one direction, and then the lesser gifts are going in the opposite direction. And you can see how that works, because it creates these trade cycles between the islands, so that you can take a gift to the island in the clockwise direction, but then you can follow the gift back in the counterclockwise direction. But those two cycles have an interaction with each other, which is this quasi-cause. And I think that's the kind of key point that they're trying to get at, is that's where you see the quasi-causes in the interaction between these two cycles.
Well, so one question I have, In the middle of this paragraph, they have the sentence, descent is at the same time flow of production and chain of inscription, blah, 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 blah. Descent, could that be interchanged here for lineage? And they're talking about that? Because that seems to be how they've been using. Descent is such a terrible word in an English context for this, but it looks like they're talking about lineage here and descendants, not so much like I descend from my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and things like that. Descent is just such an awkward word for it. Is lineage better here?
Yeah, they're talking about lineage for sure.
Okay, making sure, because descent is a terrible word.
So you got to remember, okay, I don't know whether the Trobriand Islanders are matrilineal or patrilineal, but the point is that one of the things which is flowing around these cycles is women who are being traded in marriage. If it's patriarchal, if it's not patriarchal, the women are staying at home with their fathers. But if it's patriarchal, the women are actually flowing around like the guests.
Well, and there are examples of even matriarchal societies that have not arranged marriages in the way that the father selects the bride, but that the lineage is almost chosen by everyone, that these families will get married, and that by doing so, this land will transfer over, and it's a contractual agreement more than anything. And so a lot of this chapter is talking about, again, pre-despot society, that the focus is on this descent, the lineage, and how the lineage transfers back and forth, how this is ultimately what is inscribed on the Socius. Is that fair?
And with that, like the economics of it, the resources, the partial objects, all the things that are there that can be taken stock of.
And actually, Gigi Powell brings up the reason I was asking is because descent, fucking awful word. Don't ever use that, translators, if anyone's listening. I know we have a few that come in. My question is this lineage or is this inheritance? Because lineage focuses conceptually as a word on the way families are structured, mothers related to children, which seems to be what they were talking about earlier when they were saying how filial lines and alliances work. And from my understanding of the Trobriand people and what I've read on the Kula, this feels like the focus. However, if the word descent here is about material goods that are part of that, and we're talking about inheritance, that is a drastically different implication when we're talking about the transition towards the despotic time.
So I think it's important, too, to keep in mind we're talking about territorialization, right? In the same way that the clock can be viewed as a simple technical machine or a social machine, right? It can tell you time, or it can be telling you, it can be a reminder of your place in the system of a 9 to 5 in a larger capitalist social system, or referring to that social machine of capitalism. I think in the same way, you can read descent there, and I'm kind of taking it as appropriate because I read it like a flow descends through a hierarchy. So in that way, and I think that's why the ego was important earlier, is like, do we get the ego as it descends from your parents? And it seems like the answer to that is no. But in the same way, right, descent being like, yes, lineage for sure, but also the things that come with it. For instance, like, in our society today, when you die, when your father dies, and I recently experienced this with a friend, you got to sell all of his stuff because you've inherited it. And so my friend is trying to deal with that. People leave behind things. People also give you things at a level of simple, like, administrative function, right? I might give my son a crook so he can do his job of sheep keeping or whatever.
All right. We've got a lot to discuss tomorrow, is the short version. I'm going to go ahead and continue with the next paragraph. If one postulates that somewhere there has to be a kind of equilibrium of prices, one is compelled to see the manifest disequilibrium of the relations of pathological consequence, which one explains by saying that the supposedly closed system extends in one direction and opens as the prestations become wider and more complex. But such a conception is in contradiction with the primitive cold economy, which is without net investment, without money or market, and without exchangist commodity relations. The mainspring of such an economy is a veritable surplus value of code. Each detachment from the chain produces, on the one side or the other in the flows of production, phenomena of excess and deficiency, phenomena of lack and accumulation, which will be compensated for by the non-exchangeable elements of the acquired prestige or distributed consumption type. In quotes, the chief converts this perishable wealth into imperishable prestige through the medium of spectacular feasting. The ultimate consumers are, in a way, the original producers. Surplus value of code is the primitive form of surplus value, inasmuch as it corresponds to Mauss's celebrated formula. The spirit of a thing given, or the force of circumstance that requires that gifts be reciprocated with interest, being territorial signs of desire and power, and principles of abundance and the fructification of wealth. Far from being a pathological consequence, the disequilibrium is functional and fundamental. Far from being the extension of a system that is at first closed, the opening is primary, founded in the heterogeneity of the elements that compose the prestations and that compensate for the disequilibrium by displacing it. All right. In short, the detachments from the signifying chain, in accordance with the relations of alliance, engender surplus values of code at the level of the flows, whence are derived differences in status between filiative lines, for example, superior or inferior ranks of the givers and receivers of wives. The surplus value of code carries out the diverse operations of the primitive territorial machine, detaching segments from the chain, organizing selections from the flows, and allocating the portions to each person. Despite the difficult language, I actually understood that paragraph, I think. I understood that paragraph. Give me a minute. Anyone have thoughts before we move on? Because I'm going to...
Well, I think the surplus value of code is the idea that, that in these primitive societies, both the language and these kinship structures are very complex. And so the complexity of categories and different kinds of distinctions that are in the kinship system they're like over-coded in some sense. There's a lot more coding there than is necessary just for reproductive means.
Okay, so I think that makes sense, because I think what I'm reading this section is like this is their sort of them advancing the way that they take all of this data from anthropology, from structuralist anthropology, in the way that they interpret it. And so, yeah, it's not just about reproduction of the family. That's the closed system that becomes open in a marketplace, right? It's for them, it's these signifying chains break apart, and that's sort of the fundamental nature of, I don't know, structure. Okay, words are
the fundamental process. The fundamental process that Socius is going through is the actual creation of signifiers that actually have an excess of value within their own sort of existence. That the food itself at no point is commodified. At no point, the example they use I love, and it really helped it click in my brain. When you have food, everyone just has food. That's great. Food's a food. But if the chief exists to give that excess power, suddenly the food is no longer just food. We're having a feast. And the feast is in honor of Alyosha finally getting his microphone working. And that celebration that we get to have makes that food and that celebration more than just the sum of its parts at a basic level. It's the surplus value of itself. You are called out deeply. And we will have a feast over that too, and just continue. Basically, it's continuing to create surplus value inside of each of the coded items. And that's the coding that happens inside of the sort of prehistorical setups.
I think what's interesting here is that their innovation is to say that the code can be surplus or deficient. And so it'll be interesting to see if that's what they're going to say, is that in the primitive, the code is in a surplus. In other words, there's a lot of coding going on that's unnecessary in the primitive. And then in the capitalist, there's this deterritorialization, which is an undercoding in some sense. So it'll be interesting to see if maybe they say that in the sovereign case that's a kind of middle between those excess and deficiency.
Well, and they also go into, and I think another thing that's clicking for me is their previous use in this section of the word asymmetry and unbalanced and all of that over and over, because, and again, the examples that they give of these tribes and how they react. For example, in my world now, a book is worth X number of dollars, and we have a very, very specific evenness to the way coded flows work. Everything is very much evenness in some theoretical sense, at least at a coding level. But then in these prehistorical societies, their reference to things being over or undervalued based on the coding that's happening, feels like it's intentional and everyone's aware of it and no one wants to close it out and try to make everything even. Instead, they want to talk about the excess and deficiency as being part and parcel of all of their sort of interactions at a societal level.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind to me is like economics will say this all works through an equilibrium of price and quantity, and that's your basic market, right? But I think, Brooks, you're right about what you're saying, and the reason I bring up the equilibrium is because this society functions by displacing disequilibrium. So this is not about trying to it's not about holding on to a book so it appreciates through the market and you can, right, and the equilibrium of price over time either raises or drops. This is about displacing the fundamental disequilibrium in the system, that there's always that there isn't that relationship of price and quantity whereby we can understand the society through that lens.
Yes. And I'm probably going to use the term prehistorical instead of savage just because it hurts me to say it less. It may not be completely accurate. I'm trying to say pre-despotic, but I will continue to use the term. It's probably a Freudian slip, though. That's fair. I'm going to go ahead and continue reading and keep pushing us on because I think it's worth us getting through a little bit more here. The idea that primitive societies have no history, well, son of a bitch, the next fucking line, of course, that they are dominated by archetypes and their repetition is especially weak and inadequate. They literally called me out on what I was doing just now. That's great. All right, I'll stop saying that term. This idea was not conceived by ethnologists, but by ideologists in the service of a tragic Judeo-Christian consciousness that they wish to credit with the invention of history. If what is called history is a dynamic and open social reality in a state of functional disequilibrium or an oscillating equilibrium, unstable and always compensated, comprising not only institutionalized conflicts, but conflicts that generate changes, revolts, ruptures, and scissions, then primitive societies are fully inside history and far distant from the stability or even from the harmony attributed to them in the name of a primacy of a unanimous group. The presence of history in every social machine plainly appears in the disharmonies that, as Levi Strauss says, bear the unmistakable stamp of time elapsed. It is true that there are several ways to interpret such disharmonies, ideally by the gap between the real institution and the assumed ideal model, morally by invoking a structural bond between law and transgression, physically as though it were a question of attrition that would cause the social machine to lose its capacity to wield its materials. But here, too, it seems that the correct interpretation would be, above all, factual and functional. It is in order to function that a social machine must not function well. This has been shown precisely with regard to the segmentary system, which is always destined to reconstitute itself on its own ruins, and likewise for the organization of the political function in these systems, which in effect is exercised only by the indicating its own impotence. Ethnologists are constantly saying that kinship rules are neither applied nor applicable to real marriages, not because these rules are ideal, but rather they determine critical points where the apparatus starts up again, provided it is blocked, and where it necessarily places itself in a negative relation to the group. Here it becomes apparent that the social machine is identical with the desiring machine. The social machine's limit is not attrition, but rather its misfirings. It can operate only by fits and starts, by grinding and breaking down and spasms of minor explosions. The dysfunctions are an essential element of its very ability to function, which is not the least important aspect of the system of cruelty. The death of a social machine has never been heralded by a disharmony or a dysfunction. On the contrary, social machines make a habit of feeding on the contradictions they give rise to, on the crises they provoke, on the anxieties they engender, and on the infernal operations they regenerate. Capitalism has learned this and has ceased doubting itself, while even socialists have abandoned belief in the possibility of capitalism's natural death by attrition. No one has ever died from contradictions, and the more it breaks down, the more it schizophrenizes, the better it works, the American way. Well, that last part's a great bumper sticker for sure.
Yeah, it's really awesome how the part where they stop doing these like incredibly lengthy quotes of obscure anthropology is like actually fun to read and easy to understand.
Any comments on this paragraph? It's one of the, sometimes they hit moments of clarity for me, so I don't have a ton to add very specifically.
It seems pretty clear, that paragraph.
But just to talk over again the concept of, I mean, it opens up with them talking about how they're not prehistorical, so I'm an asshole. That's what I learned. But they're talking about the creation of social machines inside of societies and how social machines work and how they always have. That there's no. One of the things that was interesting in this, as I've read it, is when they talk about social machines over time, there is no difference in the social machines pre-despot, despot, and capitalist. That they're talking almost how in the response to them, or how the Socius handles social machines is what changes. That the social machines themselves constantly are there, they're constantly breaking down, and that in the pre-despot or in despotic times, they didn't trust in the social machine. They were very terrified of them breaking down, and so they kept them going. And that's, I think, they're talking about the asymmetric nature of giving and arranged marriages and filial relations being asymmetric, but no one wanting to close that loop. Whereas now we live in a time where that's all people want to do is close that fucking loop and get the benefits. Give me the benefits. I'll break whatever machine I can. I'll break everything down. And that breakdown is what's continually happening now. I really like this paragraph. It gets it through.
This statement, no one ever died from contradictions. So Graham Priest, who's a logician, he has this position called dialetheism, where he says that, you can have local contradictions, and there's this problem of explosion, where, if you have contradictions in a logical argument, you can prove anything. But it's a different thing to have real contradiction. And so real contradictions, I think, is what they're alluding to here. But they're saying that even in the face of real contradictions, it's not something, it might cause psychological problems if you're in a double bind or something like that. But you don't die of them.
No, in fact, it's the opposite. The more it breaks down, the more it schizophrenizes, and the better it works. The American way. How do people get accelerationism from Deleuze? Always fascinating. But I do like that. I do like this last paragraph. I'm going to mark up a few notes for us to make sure we talk about things tomorrow as well. Would anyone like to read the next paragraph? Because we're starting to near the end of the section, thankfully. I'm happy to read it, though. If anyone.
I can read it.
Big please.
Okay. But this is already the point of view required. In a change of perspective for examining the primitive Socius, the territorial machine for declining alliances and filiations. This machine is segmentary because, through its double apparatus of tribe and lineage, it cuts up segments of varying lengths. Theological filiative units of major, minor, and minimal lineages with their hierarchy, their respective chefs, their elders who guard the stocks and organize marriages. Territorial tribal units of primary, secondary, and tertiary sections, also having their dominant roles and their alliances. The point of separation between the tribal selections becomes the point of divergence in the clan structure of the lineages associated with each section. Or, as we have seen, clans and their lineages are not distinct corporate groups, but are embodied in the local communities through which they function structurally. Two systems intersect, each segment being associated with the flows and the chains, with the stock flows and the passing flows, with selections from the flows and detachments from the chains. Certain production projects are executed in the framework of the tribal systems, others in the framework of the lineage system. Variability and relativity of the segments are responsible for all sorts of penetrations between the inalienable elements of filiation and the mobile elements of alliance. This is explained by the fact that the length of each segment, or even its existence as such, is determined only by its opposition to other segments in a series of interrelated stages. Momentary machine makes rivalries, conflicts and ruptures throughout the variations of filiation, the fluctuations of alliance. The whole system evolves between two poles, that of fusion through opposition to other groups, and that of secession through the constant formation of new lineages aspiring to independence, the capitalization of alliances and filiation. From one pole to the other, all the misfirings and failures in a system that is constantly reborn of its own disharmonies. What does Jean Favret mean when she shows, along with other ethnologists, that the persistence of a segmentary organization requires, paradoxically, that its mechanisms be ineffectual enough, that fear remains the motor of the whole? What is this fear? It would appear that social formations experience a morbid and mournful foreboding of things to come, although what comes to them always comes from without, rushing in through their opening. Perhaps it is even for this reason that it arises from without. Suffocate its inner potentiality at the cost of the dysfunctions that constitute an integral part of the functioning of their system.
Thank you for reading. It's there are parts of this that confuse me and some parts that I really like some of the lines. So I'm going to want to take a few minutes. We're going to extend a little bit over the 2-hour mark, just letting everyone know, because we are going to finish this section. I'm not going to let one more paragraph kick our ass. But the machine is segmentary because, though it's double apparatus of tribe and lineage, it cuts up segments of varying lengths, genealogical filiative units of major, minor, and minimal lineages with their hierarchy. Can someone give me another way of saying what they're trying to say with that, just that little section there? Because it feels like, as they talk about the territorial machine for declining alliances and filiations as things move through time, the separations, the two poles, the way that these things move into capital and become part of the despotic, this feels like they're describing, it can't be, I know I'm interpreting it wrong, a gradualist view of the descent into despotism. Please give me another way of looking at this paragraph. I would love it. Anyone?
Well, I don't know about that, but one of the things that I'd like to mention is this is kind of like the baseline situation of the primitive, but in Indo-European societies, there's also caste, and caste is kind of like if you took this system and you created multiple levels of systems like this that had discontinuities between them. And so I just wonder if they're going to get into caste systems.
So I think I can take a crack at explaining it, because I don't think I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the word gradualist, but I think the way I'm looking at it is that this is...
Really quick to say why. When they're talking and they say things like, the segmentary machine goes on to do this, and then it evolves into this, and they use the term Kraut. They actually use the term evolves, moves from one pole to another. The whole system evolves between two poles, that of fusion through opposition to other groups and the scission through the constant formation of new lineages aspiring to independence. and gradualism may be the wrong word here, but it feels like they're talking about this. This is where this slow change happens over time. It doesn't feel like that's right, and my brain can't wrap another direction. So that's where my brain is reading that, though.
Okay, yeah, I see where you're coming from, but I think instead of reading it like that, the way I'm getting it is that they're not describing the movement from, this sort of the territorial machine in this stage of history to a despotic stage of history in that section, and where so much as they're just describing this one stage of history, and what they're getting at is the way that this stage of history has the elements that are going to, through the rupture, right, the sort of next genealogical shift, are going to become the parts of the despotic machine.
There's another thing, which is the evolutionary theory. Is the mutations that cause it to advance according to Darwinian theory, and so these breakdowns could in the kinship level could be like the mutations in evolution.
And then there's the last sentence. Perhaps it is even for this reason that it arrives from without. They suffocate its inner potentiality at the cost of the dysfunctions that constitute an integral part of the functioning of their system. This whole section is about the building on the last paragraph, which talks about essentially the social machine's limits and how it's constantly breaking down, how it will break down, and the breakdown moments are the moments of production. But those breakdowns used to be in this pre-despotic time. Those breakdowns were almost expected, and they would almost be taken over due to the size of the signs, the overcoding, is that the term I should be looking for? The overassumption in the value coding. And so now they're talking about here, the way that these segments grow and change over time and continually break down also comes with the side of fear, and the fear of what happens if they don't obey that, they don't listen to that.
I read that differently. I see where you're coming from. So you're talking about that sort of that nomadic subject that they're describing, right? Where you go from place to place and you exhaust the flows at each place. And that's sort of more, there's a way that they are positioning that it's more rational. It's more proper, maybe.
It feels like that's what they're saying. But again, as I'm reading it, I'm like, that can't be the way. That's just my brain's hearing it for some reason.
Yeah, I hear that too, and I struggle with that a little bit myself. But I think what they're saying in this section is they're describing this sort of, I guess, tribal society, and that the opening that they're talking about is that sort of, they're talking about this inherent in the structure. Everyone knows that these family units aren't these closed off sealed units, and that the tribal unit isn't this closed off separate thing, right? That comes once the family unit opens. Everyone knows subconsciously, because of the nature of desiring production and the nature of partial objects, that these signifying chains are made by being broken and recreated. And that's the opening that they're afraid that something is going to get into, I think.
So another thing that's worth keeping in mind is Jacques Monod. He wrote a book called Chance and Necessity, which was supposedly a model of Darwinian evolution, but turned out to be a really good kind of abstract model for basing understanding structuralism on. And he differentiates teleonomy from teleology. And so basically what he says is that one of these systems, they have random levels, and then they have selected levels that are determinate. And there's multiple levels. You'll have one level that's random, then one level that's determinate, then a random, then determinate. And as those levels keep getting applied, then rather than having a teleology where you know where you're going from the beginning, you have what's called a teleonomy, which means that you're going to arrive at a particular end, but you're not going to know what that end is before you set out. And so that's a model of openness in something like evolution, or in something like the changes in kinship system through the mutations or these breakdowns.
I think that's very relevant with where they're going with capitalism, right? Because they aren't saying, I don't think they're saying it's a teleology where this is a progression towards something, but they're saying that capitalism is this sort of nightmare that haunts all these other societies because it is where their flows start to get decoded, and that sort of sign chains breaking proliferates more than it has in previous societies. And that I'm not sure if they would say it was inevitable, but that is, I think, where we're going with the universal history bit.
Well, and I think a lot of when they're talking about the chains breaking and the signs breaking and, the machines breaking in this society, in this pre-despotic time, it's they talk a lot about how it's very much built into the way that they handle everything. That asymmetry that one has a surplus, one has less. That setup is basically the entire plan there. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, they're going to, I think they're going to get into it in even the next paragraph, but the difference over time as these machines break and how that's treated, and that the breaking becomes literal production itself. And through the breaking, as they say in that last, I just love that. And the more it breaks down, the more it schizophrenizes, the better it works. The American way is such a sarcastic, shitty way to say it, but it's such a bumper sticker view of what they're trying to say here, I think.
Yeah, it would be inherent in the society because it's imminent in the subconscious stuff that they were talking about.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, starting to understand more. We'll discuss more tomorrow. I want to make sure we get through the last paragraph here. I'll go ahead and give that a read. The segmentary territorial machine makes use of scission to exercise fusion and impedes the concentration of power by maintaining the organs of chieftainry in a relationship of impotence within the group. As though the savages themselves sense the rise of the imperial barbarian, who will come nonetheless from without and will overcode all their codes. But the greatest danger would be yet another dispersion, a scission such that all the possibilities of coding would be suppressed. Decoded flows, flowing on blind, mute, deterritorialized Socius. Such is the nightmare that the primitive social machine exercises with all its forces and all its segmentary articulations. The primitive machine is not ignorant of exchange, commerce, and industry. It exorcises them, localizes them, cordons them off, encasts them, and maintains the merchant and the blacksmith in a subordinate position, so that the flows of exchange and the flows of production do not manage to break the codes in favor of their abstract or fictional quantities. And isn't that also what Oedipus, the fear of incest, is about? The fear of a decoded flow? If capitalism is the universal truth, it is so in a sense that makes capitalism the negative of all social formations. It is the thing, the unnameable, the generalized decoding of flows that reveal a contrario, the secret of all formations, coding the flows and even overcoding them rather than letting anything escape coding. Primitive societies are not outside history. Rather, it is capitalism that is at the end of history. It is capitalism that results from a long history of contingencies and accidents, and that brings on this end. It cannot be said that the previous formations did not foresee this thing that only came from without by rising from within, and at all costs had to be prevented from rising. Whence the possibility of a retrospective reading of all history in terms of capitalism. It is already possible to see signs of classes in pre-capitalist societies, but ethnologists observe how difficult it is to distinguish those proto-classes from the castes organized by the imperial machine and from the rankings distributed by the segmentary primitive machine. The criteria that distinguishes classes, castes, and ranks must not be sought in a fixity or a permeability, nor in a relative closing or opening. These criteria always reveal themselves to be deceptive, eminently misleading. But the ranks are inseparable, from the primitive territorial coding process, just as castes are inseparable from the overcoding practiced by the imperial state. While classes are relative to the process of an industrial and commodity production decoded under the conditions of capitalism. All history can therefore be read under the sign of classes, but by observing the rules set forth by Marx, and bearing in mind that classes are the negative of castes and ranks. For it is certain that the regime of decoding does not signify the absence of organization, but rather the most somber organization, the harshest compatibility, with the axiomatic replacing the codes and incorporating them, always a contrario. I don't have anything to add to that. But actually, we were going back and forth a bit, Muskie, but it seems like that actually explained what I was talking about better than I could. I like that.
Yeah, very clear paragraph for me too. I really liked the language. I thought it was very well written.
Any final thoughts?
Well, so they did get to castes. They're saying that castes are the despotic machine imposes castes.
It's true. But really talking about ultimately the need for everything to be territorialized and coded, because the decoded flows is the terrifying. The deterritorialized Socius, yeah.
So I'd just like to mention Dumazeal. He was the one who kind of like figured out how the caste structure was in all the different Indo-European societies. And Deleuze refers to him on occasion.
Any other final thoughts before we move on to closing out? All right, fair enough. Thank all of you again for joining us today. We will try to be getting this up for audio this evening with any luck. And tomorrow, please join us for a review, because we will be going over a bunch of different little points, and we have a lot more people who join us then. Thank all of you for everything, and we look forward to hearing from you next week. Thank you so much.